routine flight over the desert when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Abandoned trailers in a place where no road leads. But when they opened them, what was inside caused everyone to panic. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. He had grown up in a place where disappearance was ordinary. Not dramatic, not announced, not marked by sirens or headlines. Things simply stopped being there. A man who used to sit on the stoop every morning vanished between 1 week and the next. A car burned out at the curb and was hauled away before anyone bothered to ask who owned it. A corner store closed overnight and reopened months later under a different name, as if the space itself had learned to forget. In that neighborhood, absence was never questioned. It was accepted as a condition of living, like heat or dust or noise that never truly went away. The streets of his childhood were narrow and cracked, lined with buildings that leaned toward one another as if tired of standing alone. In summer, the air shimmered above the asphalt, turning distance into a liquid illusion. Windows stayed open because broken air conditioners could not be replaced, and from those windows came the sounds of arguments, laughter, televisions, prayers, music, grief. Everything spilled outward. Privacy was a luxury, silence an impossibility. Yet even there, surrounded by people, whole lives could slip out of view without leaving a trace. From early on, he learned to notice patterns others ignored. He learned that when something was missing, it was rarely an accident. Someone had decided it should be gone. Someone had benefited from its absence. Adults spoke in lowered voices when police cruisers rolled slowly past. Names were mentioned once and then never again. Questions were discouraged, not by force, but by example. Those who asked too much ended up like the others, erased in small, efficient ways. The idea that truth was fragile, that it could be bent or buried depending on where it was inconvenient, settled into him long before he had words for it. By the time he was old enough to understand how the world claimed to work, he already knew how it actually did. Official stories belonged to people with power. Everyone else lived among the gaps. The sky became his escape before he fully understood why. As a boy, he would lie on the roof of his building at night, the concrete still warm beneath his back, watching airplanes cut silent paths through the darkness. They moved with purpose, indifferent to the chaos below. From up there, the city's problems seemed to flatten and fade. He imagined a place where perspective brought order, where distance made things make sense. Flying promised exactly that. It offered height, separation, clarity. It offered a way to look down on the world without being trapped inside it. When he left for training, it felt less like ambition and more like gravity finally releasing its hold. The neighborhoods of his childhood shrank into grids and colors and then disappeared entirely, replaced by open space and regulated air. Years later, the desert felt familiar in an unexpected way. It was different from the streets he had known, but it carried the same message: vast, empty, indifferent. A place people assumed held nothing of value. A place where things could be placed and forgotten. Where mistakes could be hidden under sun and silence instead of brick and bureaucracy. Flying over the desert became routine. The missions blurred together, defined by coordinates and fuel calculations and the steady hum of engines. From above, the land looked ancient and uncomplicated, carved by forces far older than human intention. Ridges cast long shadows. Dry riverbeds twisted like pale scars across the earth. There was comfort in its apparent honesty. What you saw was what existed. Or so it seemed. He trusted that feeling more than he realized. The desert did not pretend to be anything else. It did not disguise its hostility or its emptiness. It did not promise safety. It simply was. Compared to the layered deceptions of cities, that simplicity felt almost virtuous. On the morning it happened, nothing distinguished the flight from dozens before it. The air was clean and brutally bright, the kind of clarity that sharpened edges instead of softening them. Sunlight struck the canopy at a precise angle, flooding the cockpit with glare. Instruments glowed steadily, familiar and reassuring. The desert stretched outward in all directions, a textured expanse of stone and sand and shadow. He followed the planned route without conscious thought, his body performing movements learned through repetition until they required no attention. His mind drifted, as it often did, not toward fear or anticipation, but toward memory. The rhythm of flight left room for reflection, and reflection inevitably pulled him backward, to the streets that taught him to notice what others overlooked, to the spaces where something should have been, but was not. It was that habit, more than training, that changed the course of the day. At first, the shapes registered only as interruption, straight lines where there should have been none, right angles embedded in a landscape defined by fracture and erosion. His eyes passed over them once, then returned, compelled by a sense of wrongness he could not immediately articulate. The desert did not produce symmetry. It resisted human geometry. Whatever lay below did not belong. He adjusted his position slightly, changing the angle of view. The shapes resolved into forms too regular to dismiss. Long, rectangular silhouettes clustered unnaturally within a narrow ravine. Their surfaces reflected light differently from stone, dull and uniform instead of rough and broken. They were partially obscured by shadow, wedged deep where the canyon walls closed in tightly, but there were too many of them to be coincidence. For a moment, he considered fatigue, glare, illusion. Heat could distort perception, and the desert was notorious for tricks, but his instincts refused the explanation. He had seen mirages before. This was not one of them. These shapes held their edges. They remained fixed as he altered altitude and bearing. They persisted. He began counting without meaning to. 1, 2, more, too many. The realization came slowly, like pressure building rather than a sudden shock. These were not rocks. They were not debris. They were industrial in scale and design, unmistakable once his mind accepted the conclusion. Semi-truck trailers. The thought sat heavily, refusing to integrate with the rest of the scene. Trailers belonged to roads, depots, logistics hubs. They belonged to places built to accommodate weight and wheels and fuel. They did not belong at the bottom of a remote desert canyon with no visible access route. They did not belong miles from the nearest paved surface. His training asserted itself, pushing emotion aside. He evaluated distance, terrain, feasibility. The canyon walls were steep, fractured, hostile to anything larger than a person on foot. There were no tracks leading in or out, no scars where heavy vehicles might have descended. Even with deliberate effort, placing a single trailer there would have required planning and machinery. Placing dozens bordered on impossible. Yet there they were. He felt the old tension return, the familiar pull between knowing and ignoring. He could mark the anomaly, log it as unusual terrain clutter, and continue on course. Someone else might see it later. Or never. The desert was full of things no one bothered to explain. But the shapes below carried the same weight as the empty spaces of his childhood. They were absence made visible. Evidence of an action someone hoped would dissolve into heat and time. The desert, like the neighborhood he left behind, had been chosen because people assumed it did not matter. He circled once more, just enough to be certain. The trailers lay scattered rather than neatly arranged, some angled awkwardly as if abandoned in haste. A few appeared damaged, their sides buckled or torn, metal catching the sun in jagged flashes. Whatever had brought them there had not cared about order in the end, only distance. The engines hummed steadily, indifferent to his thoughts. The sky remained cloudless, empty of witnesses. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that what he was seeing would not reveal itself again so easily. Light, angle, chance had aligned. If he turned away now, the canyon would close its mouth and swallow the secret whole. He adjusted course and began the process of documentation, hands steady despite the shift in his chest. Coordinates. Visual confirmation. Notes that stripped the moment of its unease and rendered it procedural. Official. Real. As he transmitted the information, the desert rolled on beneath him, unchanged and silent. From above, it offered no commentary, no judgment. It simply held what had been placed within it. He did not yet know what waited inside those trailers. He did not know how far the truth would reach or how quickly it would be trimmed back. He only knew that something had been hidden where no one was expected to look, and that once seen, it could not be unseen. The aircraft continued along its route, but his attention remained anchored to the ravine shrinking behind him. The desert resumed its endless patterns, convincing again in its emptiness. Yet the illusion had broken. What had once seemed vacant now felt crowded with unseen weight. From where he sat, suspended between earth and sky, he understood that perspective did not erase responsibility. It sharpened it. And whatever lay ahead would begin not with what he would find on the ground, but with the simple, irreversible fact that he had looked down and chosen not to turn away. The desert did not release him after he passed beyond the canyon. Its vastness followed him into the cockpit, into the quiet intervals between instrument checks, into the spaces where thought usually wandered without consequence. The aircraft maintained its steady course, the engines providing a constant, measured reassurance, but his attention no longer moved freely. It remained tethered to the coordinates he had marked, to the image of straight lines pressed unnaturally into a place defined by fracture and collapse. From altitude, the land had returned to its usual patterns. Ridges softened into waves of stone, shadows lengthened and thinned, the earth resumed its patient indifference. If he had not seen what he had seen, the desert would have convinced him again that it held nothing but itself. That was its power. It made forgetting feel natural. He replayed the moment of recognition with an exactness that surprised him. The way the shapes had first appeared as interruption rather than revelation. The hesitation before certainty. The quiet insistence of instinct overriding the impulse to dismiss. In his years of flying, he had learned to trust instruments before intuition, yet this time intuition had arrived first, dragging logic behind it. There was no reasonable explanation that allowed the trailers to exist where they did. He tested each possibility as though working through a checklist. A convoy accident would have left tracks, debris spread along a path, signs of attempted recovery. Military storage was regulated, documented, and never concealed in a manner that required such deliberate isolation. Illegal dumping of scrap metal would not involve intact trailers of that scale, nor the effort required to place them so deeply beyond access. The impossibility itself was the message. Someone had invested time, planning, and risk to bring those objects into that ravine. Someone had wanted them not merely abandoned, but erased. He adjusted his grip on the controls, aware of the subtle tension in his hands. The act of reporting had already set a chain in motion, yet the outcome remained uncertain. Experience told him that anomalies could be categorized, minimized, filed away with professional efficiency. A desert anomaly was easily reframed as logistical debris, a closed case without curiosity. He considered what would have happened if he had not noticed. Another flight would have passed overhead, another set of eyes guided by routine rather than attention. The sun would have continued its daily work, bleaching metal, softening edges, encouraging corrosion. Months, perhaps years later, the trailers would have become part of the landscape, mistaken for ruins or forgotten equipment. The desert was patient. It did not rush disappearance. It perfected it. The memory of his childhood returned uninvited, not as a specific scene, but as a familiar pressure. The feeling of knowing something was wrong and understanding that acknowledgement carried cost. In the neighborhoods he had grown up in, survival often depended on selective blindness. Not everything required intervention. Not everything could be fixed. The distinction between wisdom and surrender was learned early and imperfectly. He had believed flying would free him from that calculus. That distance would simplify moral decisions, reducing them to protocols and procedures. Yet, here he was again, confronted by the same quiet choice: to proceed and accept uncertainty, or to retreat into the comfort of plausible ignorance. The transmission had been concise, factual, stripped of interpretation. Coordinates, visual description, estimated number of trailers. Nothing more. He had resisted the urge to speculate, knowing speculation invited dismissal. Facts were harder to ignore, though not impossible. As he continued the flight, his mind moved forward to the inevitable response. A ground team would be assembled, briefed with caution and efficiency. The terrain would be assessed, routes mapped. Time would stretch, slowed by distance and heat and the careful pace required in hostile environments. By the time anyone reached the canyon floor, the sun would have shifted again, shadows rearranged, the desert continuing its work of concealment. He imagined the approach from the ground, the way the trailers would remain invisible until the final descent, hidden by the folds of rock. From above, their geometry had announced itself as violation. From below, they would emerge gradually, each step revealing more metal than expected, more mass than explanation allowed. The thought unsettled him more than he admitted. It suggested intention layered upon intention, concealment designed to operate at multiple scales. What was invisible from roads and trails was visible from the sky, yet only to those trained to see pattern rather than surface. The canyon had been chosen with care, exploiting assumptions about where observation occurred. He wondered who had made that calculation, whether they had considered aerial surveillance at all, or whether they had relied on probability and indifference. The desert was vast. Flights were many. Attention was limited. Most days that would have been enough. The aircraft's instruments signaled the approach of a routine checkpoint, drawing his focus back to immediate responsibilities. He complied automatically, train and guide in action while thought continued beneath the surface. The discipline of flying demanded compartmentalization, the ability to hold concern without letting it interfere with precision. He had learned that skill well, though it did not come without cost. When the flight concluded and the engines wound down, the silence felt heavier than usual. The desert heat pressed against the aircraft even at rest, radiating upward from the ground in waves. He remained seated longer than necessary, reviewing data, confirming logs, ensuring that what he had seen was recorded exactly as it needed to be. Accuracy was a form of protection, both for truth and for himself. Once clear of immediate duties, he found that the shapes below continued to occupy his thoughts with an almost physical presence. They refused abstraction. They were not merely trailers anymore, not just industrial forms misplaced in stone. They had become containers of intent, holding within them the reason someone had gone to such lengths. He did not yet imagine what might be inside. His mind circled the perimeter of that question without crossing it, aware that speculation could distract from process. Still, the weight of the unknown pressed against him. Empty trailers would have been strange enough. Filled ones suggested urgency, panic, and loss. He was informed, later that day, that a reconnaissance plan was underway. The tone was neutral, professional, interest without alarm. He noted the phrasing, the careful avoidance of adjectives that might imply significance beyond logistics. It was the language of institutions, designed to proceed without committing to interpretation. He accepted it without comment. The system moved at its own pace, governed by procedures refined to minimize disruption. He understood that impatience would not accelerate truth, only draw scrutiny. The desert rewarded patience. So did bureaucracy. As night fell, the memory of the ravine returned with sharper edges. Under darkness, the trailers would be invisible from the air, their metal swallowed by shadow. Whatever they contained would sit unchanged, insulated from attention by time and distance. The desert did not care whether it concealed innocence or crime. It offered the same service to both. He lay awake longer than usual, aware of the subtle shift that had occurred. The desert, once a place of deceptive simplicity, had revealed itself as layered and deliberate. It was not empty. It was selective. By morning, the certainty had settled. The impossibility of the geometry was not an anomaly to be corrected. It was a signal. Something had been placed where it could not belong, counting on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to notice. He had looked, and soon others would follow, tracing the path downward from the sky into the stone. The desert would resist, as it always did, offering heat, distance, and silence in defense of what it hid. But the geometry had already betrayed the secret. The transition from air to ground would be slow, measured, and fraught with obstacles. He understood that now, not as anticipation, but as inevitability. Once seen, the canyon could no longer be only a feature of the landscape. It had become a destination. And with that understanding came a quieter realization, one that echoed the lessons of his childhood. Truth did not emerge fully formed. It had to be approached, step by careful step, through terrain designed to discourage pursuit. The desert was only the first barrier. By the time the decision to send a ground team was finalized, the desert had already begun to shift into its next cycle. Heat accumulated early, clinging to the land with a weight that seemed almost deliberate, as if the terrain itself resisted intrusion. From the air, the canyon remained deceptively unchanged, its jagged outline fixed and unmoved, but those tasked with reaching it from below understood the difference between distance measured in miles and distance measured in effort. The pilot followed the preparations from a remove that felt both professional and deeply personal. He was no longer merely the observer who had noticed an irregularity. He had become the origin point of the operation, the reason resources were being redirected toward a place that had been content to remain unnoticed. That awareness sat with him uneasily, not as pride, but as responsibility. Once something was named as a destination, it ceased to be neutral ground. The planning phase unfolded with methodical precision. Satellite imagery was reviewed and cross-referenced with elevation data, slope gradients, and historical surveys of the region. Routes were proposed and discarded, each rejected path revealing new layers of difficulty. What looked manageable from above proved hostile when translated into ground reality. The canyon walls were unstable in places, fractured by time and erosion, their surfaces prone to collapse under weight. Even the approach required careful negotiation, a slow threading of armored vehicles through terrain that punished haste. He studied the maps with an intensity that surprised even him. The canyon he had seen in fragments from the sky now expanded into a complex system of ridges and choke points, each one a potential trap. There was no direct access, no clean descent. The land had not been shaped to accommodate machines, and it resisted every attempt to impose order upon it. The trailer's presence there felt increasingly deliberate, not merely concealed, but placed where recovery itself would be an ordeal. When the convoy finally moved, it did so under a sun that offered no mercy. The vehicles advanced in a staggered formation, their progress measured not in speed, but in persistence. Tires strained against loose stone. Engines labored, heat bleeding into metal and flesh alike. Every mile demanded attention. Every decision weighed against the risk of becoming immobilized in a place where assistance would be slow to arrive. The pilot did not accompany them, yet he remained connected to the movement as though tethered by an invisible line. He followed updates, sparse and factual, delivered without embellishment. Progress was steady but slow. Delays were expected. The desert did not yield ground easily. As the team drew closer, the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The open expanses narrowed, funneling movement toward the canyon's mouth. Rock formations rose higher, closing in, their surfaces bearing the scars of countless seasons. Shadows deepened, offering brief relief from the heat before giving way to the glare again. The air grew still, trapped between stone walls that blocked even the suggestion of wind. The first visual contact with the trailers came not as a sudden reveal, but as a gradual intrusion. At first, there were hints of metal where none should exist. A reflective edge catching light at an unnatural angle. A flat surface interrupting the organic chaos of rock. As the vehicles advanced, those hints resolved into undeniable forms, each one larger and more imposing than expected. From the ground, the trailers looked different than they had from above. They were not simply shapes. They were masses, heavy and oppressive, their scale magnified by proximity. Some stood upright, wedged awkwardly between stone outcroppings. Others lay tilted or partially collapsed, their frames warped by impact or heat. Their paint had faded unevenly, and in places it had been deliberately obscured, logos scrubbed away with haste rather than care. There were signs of panic everywhere. Deep gouges in the rock where metal had scraped during forced maneuvering. Tire marks that ended abruptly, as if vehicles had been abandoned mid-action. Equipment left behind that suggested the operation had been interrupted, not concluded. The canyon floor bore the marks of human urgency imposed upon an environment indifferent to it. The pilot imagined the moment when those responsible realized time had run out. The decision to abandon rather than retrieve. The calculus that weighed exposure against loss, choosing disappearance over accountability. The canyon, remote and unforgiving, had offered a solution that did not require cleanup, only abandonment. As the team secured the perimeter, their movement slowed further, caution replacing momentum. The scale of the find was now undeniable. This was not an isolated incident. not a single discarded unit. It was a collection, accumulated and then discarded in bulk, as though whatever it contained had become dangerous to possess. The silence of the canyon pressed in. Sound behaved strangely within its confines, swallowed quickly or reflected back in distorted echoes. The presence of so much metal disrupted the natural acoustics, creating pockets of dead air where even footsteps seemed hesitant. The desert, which from above had appeared expansive and open, revealed itself here as constrictive and watchful. From his distant vantage point, the pilot felt the shift in tone without needing it explained. What had begun as reconnaissance had become confrontation, not with people, but with evidence. The land itself seemed altered by the intrusion, burdened by objects that did not belong to it and resisted assimilation. He thought again of his childhood, of spaces that changed when something illicit was hidden within them, buildings that felt heavier, corners that carried tension long after the event had passed. The canyon now carried that same weight, a sense that something had been forced into silence rather than resolved. As the team prepared to inspect the trailers more closely, the pilot understood that the descent was not merely physical. They were moving from abstraction into reality, from anomaly into consequence. Whatever waited behind those metal doors would transform the operation from observation into reckoning. The desert had allowed the trailers to rest undisturbed for long enough that time itself had begun to erase their edges. Rust bloomed where paint had failed. Dust accumulated in thick layers, softening contours, making the industrial appear almost ancient. Yet the effort required to place them there contradicted any notion of accident or neglect. This was not decay. It was concealment delayed. The pilot remained aware that once the first trailer was opened, the nature of the discovery would change irrevocably. Until then, the canyon held only possibility, heavy and undefined. The descent into stone had been slow and costly, but it was only the beginning. The true depth of what had been hidden had yet to reveal itself, waiting behind locked doors that had been closed with intent and left to the desert's care. The canyon seemed to contract as attention focused on a single trailer. Until that moment, the collection of metal hulks had existed as a mass, an overwhelming accumulation that defied easy comprehension. Now, with the perimeter secured and movement slowed to deliberate steps, one unit became the center of gravity for everything that followed. The choice of which trailer to open was not random, though it appeared that way on paper. It stood slightly apart from the others, its rear doors facing outward as if frozen mid-attempt to leave. Rust had eaten through portions of its hinges, and a dark stain spread downward from the seam where the doors met, soaking into the pale dust beneath. The pilot followed the developments through delayed reports and satellite feeds, his imagination filling the gaps left by distance. He knew that moment well, the pause before an answer that could not be taken back. He had felt it countless times in his own life, standing at thresholds where ignorance was still possible if one chose not to cross. The canyon offered that pause now, holding its breath beneath the sun. The act of opening the trailer required effort. Metal had expanded and contracted under relentless heat, warping its original alignment. Locks that might once have yielded easily resisted with stubborn finality, as though time itself had reinforced the decision to keep whatever lay inside sealed away. The sound of cutting equipment echoed briefly, harsh and intrusive, before being swallowed by stone. Even that noise felt out of place, a reminder that the canyon was not meant for such actions. When the doors finally gave way, they did not swing open smoothly. One caught on a twisted hinge and resisted until forced wider, scraping loudly against the frame. The movement released a wave of air that carried weight and texture, thick and clinging, unlike the dry heat outside. It rolled outward slowly, as if reluctant to leave the space it had occupied for so long. Those closest recoiled instinctively. The smell arrived before understanding, heavy and unmistakable. It was not the sharpness of chemicals or fuel, nor the familiar decay of organic matter exposed briefly to the elements. This was layered, saturated, baked into itself by weeks or months of confinement. It spoke of life that had been present and then lost, not abruptly, but over time. Inside, the light revealed a scene that resisted immediate comprehension. The interior was packed tightly, organized with a grim efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than chaos. Rows of cages filled the space from floor to ceiling, stacked and secured to prevent shifting during transport. Some were metal, others reinforced plastic, all bearing signs of prolonged stress. Doors bent outward where pressure had been applied from within. Bars bore scratches worn deep by repeated contact. Within those enclosures lay thousands of animals. They varied in size and form, a disturbing catalog of diversity gathered for reasons that now felt obscene. Small mammals curled into themselves, their bodies shrunken and rigid. Birds lay tangled among broken perches, wings folded at impossible angles. Reptiles, their textured skins dulled and cracked, were frozen in positions that suggested movement halted mid-attempt. Many cages still contained bowls and dispensers, empty and dry, their presence only emphasizing the length of suffering that had occurred. The heat inside the trailer was oppressive, trapped and amplified by metal walls that absorbed sunlight and refused to release it. Whatever ventilation system might once have existed had long since failed, leaving the interior to become an oven. The air itself seemed exhausted, depleted of anything resembling freshness. Breathing required effort, each inhalation bringing with it the taste of decay. The pilot imagined the final days of that space with a clarity that made him tighten his jaw. The gradual depletion of water, the desperation that followed. Sounds that must have filled the trailer at first, cries and movement and the frantic energy of life resisting confinement. Over time, those sounds would have faded, replaced by stillness punctuated only by the occasional shift of a body too weak to do more than fall. It was not difficult to understand how long it had taken. The condition of the remains told the story clearly enough. This had not been a swift end. It had been an abandonment, calculated and complete. As additional trailers were opened, the pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Each revealed a variation on the same arrangement, tailored to different species but driven by the same intent. The operation had been extensive, organized, and ongoing. This was not a single shipment gone wrong. It was infrastructure, a supply chain that had functioned long enough to require scale and redundancy. The pilot felt a familiar anger rise, one he had learned to recognize but rarely indulge. It was not explosive or theatrical. It was cold and steady, shaped by the recognition of something deeply wrong, yet entirely predictable. In his childhood, he had seen people treated as expendable when circumstances shifted. Here, the logic was the same, stripped of even the pretense of humanity. Lives had been reduced to inventory, and when that inventory became a liability, it had been discarded. What struck him most was the order. There had been no attempt to free the animals, no gesture toward mitigation. Doors had been closed and locked with the knowledge that what remained inside would resolve itself in time. The desert had been chosen as accomplice, its heat enlisted to do the work that no one wanted to witness. The reports described how those present struggled to maintain professional detachment. Protocol demanded documentation, sampling, evidence preservation. Yet the scale of the loss made such tasks feel inadequate, even absurd. There was no catalog that could fully capture what had been destroyed, no photograph that could convey the density of suffering compressed into those trailers. The canyon itself seemed altered by the revelation. Where it had once appeared as a neutral container for hidden objects, it now felt complicit, its silence heavy with unspoken testimony. The metal hulks no longer read as abandoned equipment, but as coffins stacked carelessly in a mass grave. The desert, indifferent by nature, had nonetheless become the final stage for an act of calculated cruelty. From the air, the pilot had seen only shapes. From the ground, those shapes had become stories, each cage a record of intention and neglect. He understood then that whatever followed would not erase the images already formed. Even if the trailers were removed, even if the canyon were restored to apparent emptiness, the knowledge would remain. The opening of the first trailer marked a point of no return. The operation could no longer be framed as anomaly or logistical curiosity. It was now a crime of scale and deliberation, one that demanded explanation beyond the convenient fiction of abandonment. Someone had made decisions that led directly to this outcome, and those decisions had been insulated by distance and heat, and the assumption that no one would look too closely. As the sun climbed higher, the canyon filled with the dull, relentless glare of midday. Shadows shortened, offering no refuge. The work continued out of necessity. Each trailer opened, adding weight to an already unbearable total. The pilot remained removed from the physical reality, yet he felt its pressure nonetheless, a tightening that did not ease with time. He knew that what had been found inside the metal would shape everything that followed. Investigations would expand, explanations demanded. But he also knew how easily focus could shift, how quickly outrage could be redirected or diluted. The images from inside the trailers would not circulate widely. They would be archived, labeled, and stored, becoming part of a record that few would ever review. For now, the canyon held the truth in full view, exposed under a merciless sun. The metal doors hung open, their contents revealed at last. The desert had not protected what was hidden within. It had only delayed the moment when someone chose to look inside. And once opened, the trailers offered no closure, only the heavy certainty that what had happened there was not an exception, but a consequence of systems designed to operate unseen. Once the first trailer had been opened, the canyon ceased to be a place of discovery and became a site of accumulation. Each additional door widened the scope of what had already been revealed, not by surprise, but by confirmation. The pattern established inside the metal did not fracture or evolve. It repeated relentlessly, as though the operation had been designed to eliminate variation as a risk. Species changed, containment methods shifted slightly, but the underlying structure remained the same. Life was gathered, compressed, transported, and then abandoned when the balance of convenience turned against it. The pilot followed the unfolding reports with a concentration that bordered on fixation. He no longer needed vivid description to understand what each open trailer would reveal. The images had already settled into him, forming a grim architecture of expectation. Each new confirmation did not shock so much as it deepened the impression of intention. This had not been chaos. It had been a system. As the ground team continued their work, the scale of the operation emerged with unsettling clarity. The number of trailers alone suggested long-term planning and sustained logistics. This was not a single desperate act or a shipment gone wrong. It was a pipeline, one that had functioned long enough to justify redundancy. Multiple species had been transported together, sorted not by ecological compatibility but by market value and ease of containment. The desert had received them all without discrimination. The pilot began to reconstruct the unseen routes that must have fed the canyon. Forest edges where traps were set under the cover of legitimate activity. Remote breeding facilities operating under false permits. Border crossings where paperwork smoothed the passage of living cargo through channels designed for machinery and goods. Each stage required complicity, whether active or willful. Each stage assumed that the animals would never be more than units on a manifest. What had ended in the canyon had begun far earlier, far from the desert's glare. The suffering discovered there was only the final chapter of a longer process, one that thrived on fragmentation. No single participant needed to see the whole picture. Responsibility dissolved as it moved along the chain, passing from hand to hand until it disappeared entirely. The decision to abandon the trailers revealed the system's true priorities. When scrutiny intensified and risk outweighed profit, the solution had not been extraction or mitigation, but erasure. The animals were not freed because freedom had never been part of the equation. They were inventory, and when inventory became dangerous to possess, it was written off. The pilot recognized this logic immediately. He had seen it before, though never rendered with such brutal clarity. In his childhood, people were moved, displaced, discarded when they complicated someone else's plans. The language had been different, cloaked in policy and development, but the outcome was the same. Lives became obstacles. Obstacles were removed. In the canyon, that logic had been stripped of euphemism. There were no press releases, no justifications, only locked doors and the certainty that time and heat would finish the task. The desert had been selected not merely for its remoteness, but for its efficiency. It required no maintenance, no oversight. It did not question orders. As more trailers were examined, investigators began to piece together timelines. The condition of the remains suggested staggered abandonment rather than a single event. Some trailers had been left earlier, their contents further along the path of decay. Others showed signs of more recent placement. The operation had not ended in one moment of panic. It had unraveled gradually, shedding evidence as pressure mounted. This realization carried its own weight. It meant there had been opportunities to intervene, moments when different choices could have been made. Someone had opened those doors last, looked inside, and closed them again. Someone had decided that the consequences of exposure outweighed the cost of what remained within. The pilot found himself returning to the idea of distance, how it functioned as insulation. Physical distance from the canyon allowed those responsible to imagine the outcome abstractly. Temporal distance would soon do the same for those tasked with responding. The longer the investigation continued, the easier it would become to focus on procedures rather than impact, on culpability rather than loss. Reports began to include estimates, figures that attempted to quantify what had been destroyed. Numbers rose quickly, then stalled, limited by the impossibility of precise accounting. Many remains were too degraded for identification. Others had been damaged by heat and scavengers. The canyon resisted tidy enumeration, just as it resisted access. It offered evidence but not closure. The pilot understood the danger of those numbers. They could shock briefly, then dull perception. Large figures had a way of flattening complexity, turning suffering into statistics that could be debated, contextualized, and ultimately ignored. He had watched that process unfold countless times in other contexts. The first reaction was outrage. The second was analysis. The third was fatigue. He sensed that the investigation was already shifting into its next phase, one defined less by discovery than by containment. The question was no longer what had happened, but how far responsibility extended and how visible that responsibility would become. Each additional layer uncovered increased the likelihood of discomfort for parties accustomed to operating without scrutiny. The canyon, meanwhile, continued to absorb the activity around it without response. The trailers stood open now, their contents exposed, yet the land itself offered no indication of judgment. The desert did not recoil from what had been done within its bounds. It simply remained, waiting for the next stage of human attention to pass. For the pilot, the knowledge settled into a heavier form. He recognized that the cruelty uncovered was not aberrant, not the product of uniquely malicious individuals. It was procedural, enabled by systems that rewarded efficiency and punished hesitation. The animals had suffered not because someone hated them, but because no one had been willing to disrupt a profitable process on their behalf. This understanding stripped away any illusion of distance he might have maintained. The canyon was not an isolated crime scene. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet agreements that allowed such operations to function. Agreements to look away, to delegate responsibility, to accept loss as an acceptable byproduct of commerce. As the day wore on and the sun traced its slow arc overhead, the work continued. Evidence was cataloged, samples were taken, documentation proceeded with the diligence required by protocol. Yet beneath that structure lay an unspoken recognition that no report could fully capture what had been uncovered. No conclusion would feel proportionate to the reality of the loss. The pilot remained attentive, not because he expected justice to follow, but because attention itself felt like resistance. He knew how easily the narrative could be reshaped, how quickly the focus could shift from victims to process. Maintaining clarity required effort, a refusal to let the story shrink into something manageable. By the time evening approached, the canyon held fewer uncertainties but more weight. The logic behind the cruelty had been exposed, but understanding did not soften its impact. If anything, it deepened it. What had happened there was not inexplicable. It was rational within a framework that valued profit over consequence and concealment over accountability. That realization marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer about uncovering a mystery. It was about confronting a system that functioned precisely as designed. The descent into stone had led to something far more expansive, a recognition that the desert was merely the final repository for decisions made far from its heat. The pilot understood then that whatever came next would not be determined by what had been found, but by how much of that truth the system was willing to absorb before it began to protect itself. The canyon changed again when the system arrived, not in any visible way that could be captured from a distance, but in tone, in rhythm, in the subtle reordering of priorities that followed the arrival of authority. The early hours after discovery had been defined by immediacy, by the raw presence of what lay exposed inside the trailers. Now that exposure began to narrow, guided into channels that could be managed, categorized, and eventually closed. Vehicles bearing unfamiliar markings joined those already present, their arrival announced not by urgency but by procedure. Personnel moved with a practiced efficiency that carried no trace of surprise. Clipboards appeared, cameras were repositioned, temporary boundaries were redrawn, not to protect the scene from contamination, but to organize it according to jurisdiction. The canyon, once a place of accidental revelation, became a regulated environment governed by rules that existed long before anyone knew what lay hidden there. From where he stood, removed from the physical site, the pilot sensed the shift almost immediately. Reports that had once carried the weight of discovery began to change in texture. Language grew more precise, more careful. Descriptions tightened. Words that implied suffering or intent were replaced with neutral terminology. The trailers were no longer vessels of death, but units. The animals were no longer lives lost, but biological material. The act of abandonment softened into phrases that suggested logistical failure rather than moral collapse. He had heard this language before. It was the dialect of institutions protecting themselves from implication. Words selected not for accuracy, but for insulation. Each adjustment in phrasing shaved away a layer of emotional consequence, rendering the situation easier to discuss without confronting its full weight. As federal agents took control of the investigation, the scope of inquiry was defined with deliberate restraint. Focus centered on transport violations, permit irregularities, and breaches of environmental regulation. These were familiar categories, comfortable in their specificity. They allowed the case to be framed as an administrative failure rather than a systemic crime. The canyon became a site of non-compliance instead of a mass grave. The pilot followed these developments with a growing sense of unease. He understood the necessity of structure, the role of process in preventing chaos, yet he also recognized how easily process could become a shield. The more thoroughly the situation was compartmentalized, the less room remained for uncomfortable questions. Who had ordered the abandonment? Who had decided that no effort would be made to save what remained alive? Who had calculated that the desert would do its work quietly enough to erase responsibility? Those questions hovered at the edges of official discussions, but rarely crossed into formal inquiry. Each one threatened to expand the investigation beyond manageable limits. Each one risked implicating entities accustomed to operating without scrutiny. The system responded as it often did, by narrowing its gaze until only what could be addressed without disruption remained in focus. On the ground, the physical reality of the canyon was gradually transformed to match this shift. Evidence was collected and removed. Remains were transferred into sealed containers, labeled and cataloged according to protocol. The open trailers were closed again, not to conceal their contents, but to control them. The canyon's raw exposure to what had occurred was softened, wrapped in layers of procedure that created distance even for those standing within it. The pilot imagined the scene as it now unfolded, the heat unchanged, the rock walls still pressing inward, yet the emotional charge dampened by routine. People moving through the space not as witnesses, but as functionaries. Each action justified by necessity, each step contributing to a process designed to conclude. He recognized the pattern because he had lived it in different forms. After incidents in his childhood neighborhood, officials would arrive, take notes, speak in measured tones, and depart. The presence of authority reassured some, angered others, but always signaled the beginning of forgetting. Once the system had acknowledged an event, it could be filed away. The canyon was following that trajectory now. Its story was being shaped into something that could be archived. As days passed, the initial shock receded from official communications. Updates became less frequent, more technical. The emphasis shifted toward compliance reviews and interagency coordination. The word cruelty rarely appeared. Intent was discussed only in terms of negligence. The language of moral failure was replaced by the language of oversight. The pilot found himself increasingly attuned to what was not being said. Entire avenues of inquiry remained untouched. The markets that had demanded the animals, the financial networks that had funded their capture and transport, the regulatory blind spots that had allowed such scale to operate undetected. These were acknowledged abstractly. If at all, their investigation deferred indefinitely under the guise of complexity. He understood the reasoning. Pursuing those threads would require time, resources, and political will. It would invite resistance. It would disrupt established relationships. Easier by far to focus on the most visible layer, to hold a handful of individuals accountable while leaving the structure intact. From a distance, the canyon began to fade from public awareness. There were no dramatic press conferences, no images released that might linger in collective memory. The story appeared briefly in specialized reports, framed as a successful interdiction rather than a tragedy. The emphasis rested on prevention, on what had been stopped rather than what had been lost. This reframing unsettled the pilot more than outright denial would have. It suggested that the system could absorb the event without meaningful change, converting it into proof of its own effectiveness. The discovery of the trailers became evidence that safeguards worked, rather than evidence of how thoroughly they had failed. He felt the familiar frustration rise, tempered by an understanding of how entrenched such mechanisms were. Outrage alone could not dismantle them. Neither could attention, sustained or otherwise. The system was designed to endure scrutiny by reshaping it. On the ground, the final stages of processing continued. The canyon's appearance shifted back toward neutrality as equipment was removed and tracks erased. The desert reclaimed its surface quickly, wind smoothing disturbed soil, dust settling over the marks of human presence. What remained would soon be indistinguishable from any other remote ravine, its history preserved only in records few would read. The pilot thought often of the animals whose lives had ended there, of how completely they had been absorbed into process. Their suffering had been acknowledged, documented, and then transformed into data points that supported regulatory adjustments. Their individuality, their existence beyond classification, dissolved into abstraction. He knew this outcome was not the result of malice on the part of those now involved. Most believed sincerely in the value of their work. They operated within constraints, guided by incentives that rewarded resolution over reckoning. The system did not require cruelty to function. It required only compliance. As the investigation moved toward formal closure, the pilot sensed his own role diminishing. He had been the one who noticed, who initiated the descent. Now that the system had taken over, his perspective held less weight. The story no longer belonged to observation, but to documentation. This transition marked another familiar moment. The point at which an event slipped from lived reality into institutional memory, where complexity was compressed and discomfort reduced to manageable summaries, where the truth survived, but only in forms that posed no threat. The canyon, once exposed, was being sealed again, not with doors and locks, but with language and procedure. The system had arrived, and with it came the promise of order and the certainty that some questions would remain unasked. The pilot understood then that whatever justice might follow would be limited by design. The desert had revealed what it held, but revelation alone was not enough. Without sustained willingness to confront the implications, the discovery would become just another entry in a long ledger of losses quietly absorbed by distance and time. As the final reports were drafted and signatures collected, the canyon's significance began to recede. The system moved on, as it always did, carrying with it a version of the truth that could be handled. What remained behind was a silence restored, heavier now for having been briefly disturbed. The pilot felt the weight of that silence settle, recognizing it as the same quiet that had followed so many disappearances before. Different place, different scale, same outcome. The system had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end. The closing of the case did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, dispersed across forms, signatures, and quiet confirmations that the work had reached a point of administrative sufficiency. There was no announcement to mark the transition, no clear boundary between investigation and conclusion. Instead, the canyon's story thinned out, stretched across memos and internal updates until it lost the density that had once made it impossible to ignore. From the pilot's vantage point, the change was perceptible in tone before it was visible in action. Communications that had once arrived with urgency now came framed as updates rather than developments. The language signaled resolution, even when details remained unsettled. The discovery had been absorbed, transformed into something that could be managed within existing structures. The system had done what it was designed to do: reduce complexity to closure. On the ground, the process of removal began with the same efficiency that had characterized every stage since federal oversight took hold. Heavy equipment returned to the canyon, its presence justified as remediation rather than extraction. The trailers, once so jarring in their incongruity, were prepared for departure. Doors that had been forced open were secured again, not to conceal their contents, but to ensure containment. What had been revealed to sunlight was now re-enclosed, transferred from the openness of the canyon into the controlled anonymity of transport. The pilot imagined the scene as the trailers were hauled away, one by one, their mass straining against machinery designed to restore order. The canyon floor, scarred by tracks and disturbed earth, bore the marks of departure as clearly as it had borne those of arrival. Yet, even those marks began to soften almost immediately. Dust settled, wind moved across exposed soil, erasing sharp lines, smoothing evidence of intrusion. The desert resumed its ancient task of assimilation. Each trailer's removal narrowed the physical footprint of the event, compressing it back into abstraction. What had once occupied space now occupied only records. The canyon's transformation was swift, almost unsettling in its efficiency. Within days, the most obvious signs of human presence were gone. What remained required memory to recognize. The formal conclusions of the investigation followed a familiar pattern. A small number of individuals were identified as directly responsible for specific violations. Charges were filed that reflected what could be proven within existing legal frameworks. Transport irregularities, falsified permits, breaches of environmental regulation. The language of accountability was precise and limited, calibrated to avoid expansion. Names that might have led outward, upward, or deeper into the structure were absent. The networks that had enabled the operation remained largely untouched, acknowledged only as context rather than targets. The logic was implicit and widely understood. Pursuing those threads would complicate resolution, introduce resistance, and extend timelines beyond acceptable bounds. The pilot read the summaries with a steady attention that masked his frustration. He recognized the familiar pattern of scapegoating without malice, a process that assigned blame where it was easiest rather than where it was most accurate. The individuals named had played roles, certainly, but they were not the architects. They were the visible edges of a structure that preferred to remain unseen. As the case moved toward official closure, the canyon itself disappeared from discussion. References shifted to broader terms, regional impacts, procedural lessons. The specificity that had once anchored the narrative dissolved. Without the physical site as a focal point, the story lost its gravity. It became portable, adaptable, capable of being summarized without discomfort. Media attention, limited from the beginning, faded entirely. There were no images to sustain interest, no dramatic confrontations to extend the story's life. What coverage had existed framed the discovery as a successful intervention, emphasizing prevention and enforcement rather than loss. The suffering uncovered inside the trailers was acknowledged briefly, then set aside in favor of outcomes that could be measured positively. The pilot noted how quickly the language of success replaced the language of harm. The emphasis rested on what had been stopped, not on what had been destroyed. This reframing was subtle, almost elegant in its efficiency. It allowed the system to emerge reinforced rather than challenged, its legitimacy affirmed by its ability to respond. On paper, the case was resolved. The trailers had been removed, the remains processed. Regulatory gaps identified, recommendations drafted. Each step contributed to a sense of completion that was difficult to dispute, especially for those who had not stood in the canyon or breathed its air. For the pilot, the sense of closure felt false, incomplete. He carried images that did not translate into reports, impressions that resisted summarization. The canyon, now described as remediated, remained fixed in his mind as it had been at the moment of revelation, a place where intent had manifested in silence, where abandonment had been mistaken for erasure. He reflected often on how easily the physical world absorbed the event. The desert had reclaimed the canyon with indifference, its vastness swallowing evidence without effort. There was something deeply unsettling in that efficiency, in the knowledge that nature itself could become an accomplice to forgetting simply by continuing to exist as it always had. The system's closure mirrored that process. By restoring order, it facilitated forgetting, not through denial, but through completion. Once a case was closed, attention moved on. Resources were reallocated. The narrative concluded. The pilot understood that this was not failure in the traditional sense. It was function. The system was never designed to dwell on loss beyond what was necessary to address it administratively. Mourning was not part of its mandate. Memory, unless tied to policy change, held little value. He found himself thinking again of his childhood, of the way incidents would flare briefly before settling into the background of everyday life. How people adapted not by resolving injustice, but by absorbing it. The canyon had followed the same arc, scaled up but no less personal in its effect. As the final documentation was completed, the canyon became a line item rather than a location. Coordinates replaced description, dates replaced duration. What had once demanded presence now required only reference. The transition was complete. The pilot felt a quiet, persistent grief take shape beneath his composure. Not grief in the dramatic sense, but a steady awareness of what had been lost and how little of it would be remembered. The animals whose lives had ended there would not be named. Their stories would not be told. They would exist only as evidence, then as archived data, and finally as absence. He recognized that this erasure was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of systems designed to manage harm without internalizing it. By containing the event within acceptable boundaries, the system protected itself from the need to change. The canyon, stripped of its temporary significance, returned to its prior state in the eyes of the world. A remote, empty place, a stretch of land without history. But for the pilot, the trace remained. It persisted not in the environment, but in perception. Once the desert had revealed its capacity to hold such secrets, it could never be seen as empty again. Every ravine, every fold of land carried the possibility of similar concealment. The erasure of the canyon story did not diminish its impact on him. If anything, it sharpened his awareness of how easily truth could be buried without resistance. The system had done its work thoroughly, leaving behind a landscape that appeared unchanged. Yet, beneath that surface lay the knowledge of what had been hidden there and how quickly it had been absorbed into silence. The trace had been erased from the world, but not from him. And that, he understood, was the final consequence of discovery without reckoning. The burden of memory shifted from the collective to the individual, from records to conscience. The canyon no longer needed to remember. Someone else would do it instead. The return to routine came quietly. No announcement marked it, no sense of transition beyond the gradual thinning of urgency in his days. Flights resumed their familiar cadence. Checklists replaced briefings. The sky reclaimed its role as workspace rather than witness. From the outside, nothing about his life suggested that anything fundamental had changed. Yet the desert no longer appeared the same. From the air, it remained vast and deceptively simple, an expanse of stone and sand stretching toward every horizon with the same ancient indifference it had always displayed. Light still moved across it in predictable arcs, casting shadows that lengthened and retreated with mechanical precision. Ridges still broke the land into repeating patterns. Dry channels still traced the memory of water that had not flowed in generations. To anyone else, it was unchanged. To him, it was crowded. Each flight carried him over terrain that now felt weighted with possibility. Places that once registered as empty registered instead as unresolved. Every canyon, every narrow ravine pressed into the rock suggested depth beyond what could be seen from altitude. The desert no longer read as absence. It read as storage. He did not search for the canyon consciously. He did not need to. His body remembered the coordinates without effort, the way a wound remembers pressure long after it has closed. When his route brought him near that region of airspace, his awareness sharpened instinctively, attention tightening around the landscape below. From above, the canyon showed no sign of what had occurred, no metal glinting in shadow, no disturbed earth, no shapes out of place. Wind and time had completed their work efficiently. The desert had absorbed the intrusion and returned to equilibrium, leaving no evidence that it had ever held anything but itself. That erasure unsettled him more than the discovery itself had. He had grown accustomed to visible scars, to places where harm left marks that could be pointed to and named. Burned buildings, vacant lots, broken infrastructure. The canyon offered none of that. It presented itself as innocent, untouched, even beautiful in its severe geometry. Without knowledge, there was no reason to suspect anything had ever gone wrong there. He realized then that the most effective concealment did not rely on force or secrecy alone. It relied on normalcy, on the assumption that what appeared natural was harmless. The desert excelled at that illusion, its emptiness convincing precisely because it was so vast. The memory of the trailers returned not as images, but as weight. The heaviness of metal placed where it did not belong. the silence that followed the last sound of life inside those sealed spaces. The knowledge that abandonment could be executed so completely that even memory struggled to hold on to it. He did not speak of the canyon often. When it came up, if it came up at all, it was in the context of procedure or experience, stripped of emotional content. He had learned long ago how easily expression could be mistaken for instability, how quickly moral weight could be reframed as personal fixation. Silence, once again, proved more sustainable. Yet silence did not mean forgetting. In quiet moments between tasks, his mind returned to the idea that had taken shape since the discovery. That emptiness was not a natural state. It was often the result of removal, of deliberate action taken to erase complexity. The desert, in that sense, was not unique. It was simply honest about its function. He thought of the neighborhoods he had left behind, of spaces where lives had been displaced and then spoken of as blight or renewal. He thought of the canyon and the animals whose lives had ended there without witness. Different contexts, identical logic. Remove what complicates the narrative. Allow the environment to do the rest. The system had moved on, as systems always did. Policies adjusted, recommendations filed, new priorities established. The discovery became a reference point rather than an open question, a closed chapter rather than a continuing concern. Whatever discomfort it had generated dissipated into the background noise of institutional memory. He understood that no system could function if it dwelled endlessly on its failures. He also understood the cost of that efficiency. What was not remembered could be repeated without resistance. What left no visible mark invited recurrence. From the sky, he saw how easy repetition would be. The desert offered endless locations indistinguishable from one another, countless places where something could be placed and left to disappear. The canyon had not been unique. It had simply been chosen. That realization did not lead him toward despair, but toward vigilance. A quiet, uncelebrated vigilance that did not announce itself or seek validation. He had learned that attention itself was an act, one that did not require authority to be meaningful. The simple refusal to assume emptiness was enough to alter perception. He began to look differently at the land beneath him, not suspiciously, but attentively. Patterns mattered. Geometry mattered. Anything that resisted the logic of its surroundings demanded acknowledgement. He trusted that instinct now more than ever, aware that what he noticed might never become a case, might never be acted upon, but would nonetheless exist as knowledge. The desert did not offer redemption. It did not promise justice. It simply held what was given to it. Responsibility, he understood, did not belong to the land. It belonged to those who chose to use it as cover. As time passed, the immediacy of the canyon softened, but it did not fade. It settled into him as a reference point, a quiet recalibration of how he understood the world from above. Distance no longer equated to detachment. Perspective did not absolve responsibility. It clarified it. On one flight, months later, he passed over a stretch of land that looked identical to 100 others. No markers, no anomalies. Just rock and shadow arranged into familiar patterns. He realized that anyone else would have dismissed it without thought. He did not. The desert, he had learned, was not empty. It was patient. It waited for human intention to shape it, for decisions to be enacted far from scrutiny, for consequences to be outsourced to heat and time. It remembered nothing, but it concealed everything. That was its role, and it performed it flawlessly. As his aircraft moved steadily forward, the horizon unchanged and endless, He accepted that memory would not be preserved by systems or landscapes. It would persist only through those willing to carry it without instruction or reward. The canyon no longer needed to speak. It had already done its work. What remained was the knowledge of what could be hidden in plain sight and how easily the world could look past it. From where he flew, suspended between earth and sky, he understood with a certainty that did not require articulation. The most dangerous places were not those filled with chaos, but those mistaken for nothing at all. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories we're already preparing. Watch our other videos to see what else the world tries to hide in silence. And share this video, because some stories